love that grapefruit. Now, if you're new to mixing and you're scouring YouTube, you probably think that mixing is nothing more than a collection of tricks, hacks, techniques, EQ techniques, compression techniques, as well as the search for problems and problem frequencies. Well, I have news for you. When it comes to achieving real results with your mixes, pro level results, that's not what mixing is all about. As a matter of fact, most of the time that you sit down to mix, you should be doing very little of what I just mentioned. So the question is, what should you be doing when you sit down to mix? Well, that's what I'm gonna share with you in this video. Let's dive into it. Now, if you're a seasoned professional and you've been producing records for decades and you have a full roster of top-level clients, this video is not for you. You're gonna know all the stuff that I'm gonna share with you in this video. The problem is beginners, especially non-professional producers and mixers, don't know what I'm about to share. And believe me, it shows by the questions that I get and the mixes that people send me. So like I said in the beginning of this video, when it comes to mixing is not a collection of hacks and EQ techniques and compression techniques. Not to say that you won't do any of that stuff when you sit down to mix, but there are a lot more important things to focus the majority of your energy on, and that's what I'm gonna be sharing with you right now. And also, if you stick around to the end of this video, I think you're going to find the fifth reason extremely interesting, and I'm willing to bet it's something that you've probably never even considered. A very underrated technique, so stay tuned. So when it comes to mixing and achieving pro-level results, the first thing, the most important thing right off the bat is getting your balance right. And what I mean by balance, it's super simple. The level of the instruments in your mix, the fader level. Now this might seem overly simplistic, and it's so much more fun to dive into EQ techniques, plugin selection, compression techniques, but I want you to think about something. The different levels that you set your instruments, when you vary the levels within your mix and you vary the levels of the individual instruments or the part of the drum kit or the different guitar tracks and vocal tracks, what you're actually doing is setting the EQ balance of your entire mix. Yes, that's right. We have to remember that all sounds on planet Earth are made up of different frequencies. So for example, if you have your drum set, right, and you crank up your kick drum, and your kick drum naturally is more low end heavy, you are increasing the low end of your mix as a whole. Or if your guitars are very dark and meaty in the low mids and you crank up your rhythm guitar tracks, all of a sudden your mix might sound boxy and overly low mid heavy. So before you start worrying about fancy plugins and match EQ and all of these other fancy pants techniques, remember, level is king. Setting your levels right in the first place will get you at least 50%, maybe even 60 to 70% of the way to a great sounding production. Always remember that. Level is king, and don't overlook it. And I have good news for you. Level is free, requires 0 plugins. Just balancing faders in your DAW. Okay, the second thing that's important when you sit down to mix that people don't talk about enough. Very simple, panning. And the good news about this, believe it or not, you really don't have to think about panning all that much. If you study the greats, Chris Lord-Alge, Jordan Valeriot, or any other top-notch rock or metal or even pop mixer, you'll notice that the vast majority of their tracks are either hard left, up the middle, or hard right. Now, yes, there are a few exceptions. Maybe you might want to pan your toms in, or your background lead guitars in, or your background vocals in. But the majority of your tracks, if you want a modern, full sounding mix, should be hard left, up the middle, or hard right. Please don't overthink this. It is a plague that has infested the internet because the pros really don't think about it much, and neither should you. And again, panning is free. No plugins required. Take those stereo wideners and throw them in the trash. Okay, the third technique that you should be focusing on is filtering, and more specifically, high pass filtering. Again, I get questions all the time where people will ask me, do you cut 1K on your snare and boost 1K on your guitar so things fit together? Do you cut from 150 to 2K on your vocal and then boost that range on your cymbals so that they stop fighting with one another? Here's the thing, that makes absolutely no sense because different source files have different frequency responses. But there is one common thread amongst any file or any source when you're mixing, and that's that you don't always need the excess amount of low end that's inherent within any raw file or most raw files. Let me explain. Let's say you have a snare drum track. It doesn't matter what snare drum track it is or where it was recorded. There's probably gonna be a bunch of 80 hertz and 50 hertz that you do not need. That's when high pass filtering comes in. Vocals. You're not gonna really need anything below 100 hertz on a vocal. Lead guitars. You're not really gonna need much below 250 on lead guitars. And the thing is, by getting rid of all of these sub-frequencies that you don't need, you end up increasing the amount of headroom available in your mix, which will make mixing so much easier. And fun fact, if you get this right, you don't have to overthink EQ because your levels will be set properly, and the extra headroom from the cleaned up low end will get you 85% of the way there. I'm not exaggerating. If you're interested in this, there's a link to a training below in this video where I go in depth. Check it out if you'd like to learn more about where to set your high pass frequencies. So that's number 3. Focus on high pass filtering instead of overcomplicating EQ. It's unnecessary, and high pass filtering will get you way closer to the results that you're really looking for, believe me. Okay, number 4, this is a big one. Automation. No one wants to do it. It's boring. It's not as fun as going on Sweetwater or some website and downloading the latest and greatest SSL emulation. I know, but here's the thing. When you mix a track, specifically if you have a decent amount of tracks within your song, like beyond 20, you're probably going to need to automate your track so that there's room in your mix for everything to be heard. You cannot set and forget mixes. That's not how this works. Pros have been automating mixes in the studio for decades, and before automation existed, they would physically automate their mixes by riding the faders when printing their final mix. An example I like to use with people are guitar tracks. When a lead guitar pops in, you should probably tuck the rhythm guitars back a little. You can't just stack a bunch of tracks on top of each other and then have them drop out and expect your mix to sound cohesive and consistent. Doesn't matter how fancy of parallel compression you're using or what fancy EQ technique or linear phase plugin that you're using, your track is not going to sound professional if you don't use some form of automation, specifically volume automation. All the time, people will send me mixes saying, Bobby, rate my mix. Just want to let you know, I didn't edit anything and I'm not using automation. Well, guess what? Don't send me your mix if you're not using automation because your mix is not done, I promise you. And again, automation is free, costs $0. So if I were you, I'd start using it. Once I started using automation and I saw how powerful it was, I fell in love with it. And I couldn't even imagine attempting to mix a track without some form of volume automation. It just adds too much to the music. It makes the mixes sound way too professional to skip. Believe me. Okay, now, number 5. Like I said earlier in this video, I said you're gonna be shocked by number 5, and it's a big one, and most people don't even think to do this, but the pros do it. Specifically, pros that mix other people's songs, or maybe songs that they did not produce themselves. Are you ready? Okay, muting tracks. In other words, not using some of the tracks in your production. Let me give you some real world examples of what I mean. A lot of times when people will send me their songs to mix, they'll give me like 10 microphones on a guitar cab. And guess what? Most of them sound like crap. I'm not going to use them in the final mix. It's unnecessary. I pick the microphone that sounds the best and I roll with it. Maybe, if I'm feeling crazy, I'll use a second microphone, but that's 1 out of 20 times. Usually it's just the best sounding microphone and I move on. Also, if you have a production that you're mixing and maybe the engineer, could be you, recorded, 20 background vocals. But when you're mixing the track, some of the vocals just aren't adding to the production. Maybe there's a vocalist that has a weird timbre, maybe the guitar player did some backup vocals and he doesn't sound that great, but the main vocalist does sound great. Guess what? You could delete those tracks that are not adding to your production, especially if it's just a double or a triple, or maybe a harmony that's not jiving. The mute button in your DAW is extremely powerful, especially when you're working on a production that has a lot of unnecessary tracks. I hear it all the time. Same thing goes with drum tracks. Someone might be gung-ho with room microphones and there might be, I don't know, 10 room microphones on the kit when most of them don't sound that great, but the main stereo pair does sound great. Don't be afraid of muting those other tracks. You probably don't need it. This is very common with hi-hat tracks. Most of the time, the hi-hat tracks in my mixes, whether it's programmed drums or live drums, are completely muted and not being used because hi-hat gets into every single microphone on a drum kit. When it comes to audio production and achieving pro level results, often less is more. It's about focusing on the things that really make a difference and that actually matter and cutting out all the crap that's diluting your progress. As I've described in this video, most of your results have nothing to do with gear. It's your process and your mindset and the system that you follow when you sit down to record and mix your music. A lot of us don't achieve the results that we really want because we're stuck down these rabbit holes because of maybe YouTube videos you're watching or forums on Gearspace that are telling you otherwise and that are distracting you from what really matters. I don't want this for you. I want you achieving great results with the gear you're currently using. And because of this, I'm giving you direct access right now to my free training, 4 dead simple ways to massively improve your recordings and mixes. In this training, you'll learn my #1 technique for how to prep heavy guitar tracks that virtually mix themselves. You'll also learn how to create instantaneous clarity within your mixes using any old stock EQ plugin. You'll learn how to take control over the levels in your mixes so that instruments stop fighting with one another. And finally, you'll learn how to craft radio-ready vocal mixes using only stock plugins. Now, full disclosure, if you're one of these people that's constantly scrolling through TikTok and you have the attention span of a squirrel, don't waste your time. Please don't register for the training. This training is meant for people who are serious about audio production like I am. Now, if you are serious and you're tired of chasing your tail and you just want to produce better sounding music, there's a link below to the free training. Click it. You can have direct access right now. Now, don't get me wrong. Mixing is important, but there's a lot more to home recording that you might not be aware of. If you'd like to learn a little more about how to improve your home recordings so that mixing becomes even easier, watch this video. I think you'll find it informative and you'll learn a few lessons that will make the mixing process exponentially easier. Till next time, drink that, Spindrift.